and welcome to We the Students, a political discussion sponsored by Nauset Regional High School's AP U.S. Government and Politics program in collaboration with Nauset Video Production class. During the next 30 minutes, our panel, made up of 10th, 11th, and 12th grade Nauset students, will discuss the future of the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Specifically, should the prison be closed or remain open? I am your guest host, Tyler Cremens, a senior here at Nauset and a veteran of the AP Government class. Just for the record, opinions expressed here belong to the panelists and are not the views of Nauset Regional High School or the Nauset Regional School District. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a special email address for our panel today. Please feel free to email us your thoughts and suggestions about today's topic, so we can continue this discussion in our government classroom. Now let's meet our panel. On the right, we have Brian Nelson, Elena O'Connor, and Jack Auer. And on the left, we have Brian O'Sullivan, Haley Wright, and Sonia Berquist. So let's jump right into it, guys. I want someone to give me a brief overview of what is Guantanamo Bay Prison in Cuba. Where is it? What's the history behind it a little bit? And who's currently being held there, and what's the policy around it? Sure thing, Brian.
I can start right off. Okay, so when Cuba was first declaring its independence from the United States, we signed an agreement with them that assured that the U.S. would remain in possession of the land that is now Guantanamo Bay, unless mutually agreed upon by the two countries to go back on that agreement. And so since that time, it's been used for several purposes as a naval base, as a place to house refugees, fugitives from other countries. And currently, it is used as a detention camp for terrorists. Right now, there are 90 to 100 inmates currently.
So I guess my first question that comes up with this is, what is the legality of this? They're prisoners of the U.S. offshore. What kind of rights do they have? What's going on with the situation?
Well, they do have habeas corpus, which is the rights of a prisoner, and they do get to know what they're being charged with and why they're being kept. They also have the right to counsel, and they have military commissions where you can go before a judge and they can tell you why you're being charged, and they can decide whether you're being held there legally.
Oh, I'd like to interject quickly. So actually a very small portion of the people there have been charged, less than 1% or so, have actually been charged with formal charges. Also, they have been consistently denied the right to counsel. The military tribunals there do not meet international standards for fair trials. But even with the trials that are weighted so heavily against these inmates, where they can use evidence misproperly attained, not have lawyers helping them, there's still like such a low percentage of people actually charged.
And I think the biggest thing is not what the prisoners have, but what they don't have. And that's basic human rights and like liberty, life, and many of these prisoners are tortured and sexually assaulted, which is not like what you expect from the United States intelligence.
Well, based on like the 2004 Supreme Court case Hamden versus Rumsfeld, they have minimal protection under Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which means like no violence to life in person, no humiliating and degrading treatment, mutilation, torture. And so they do have basic human rights. Whether the Bush administration followed that is not about what is happening now. Like the Obama administration doesn't do enhanced interrogation. And so like if we reform Guantanamo Bay and make sure that these laws are followed, then these prisoners won't lose their basic human rights.
But because that has happened in the past, human rights have been violated, I think it's important to close Guantanamo Bay now so that the next president, even if it still continues to be open, doesn't fall back on what Bush did. And yeah.
Well, I mean, even before it was used to home detainees, it was used as a naval base, and it had other purposes beforehand. So it could revert back to those things, or it could, if we go through reform and we have more transparency in the Guantanamo Bay, then we can ensure that people are not being treated without their basic human rights. And another thing I want to mention is that, prisoners don't really have liberty anywhere because they're prisoners. They're in a cage all day, so that's not really liberty.
Well, it's less about liberty, really, and more about their basic rights, which are ensured by the United Nations and the Geneva Convention, which have been violated very frequently, especially in the past, with torture practices like waterboarding. That doesn't go on as much now because they actively sought to clean that up. But under the Bush administration following 9/11, they were literally torturing them. So.
I do want to bring up that we did pass a bill, the Detainee Treatment Act, where we did prohibit cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and we also provide uniform standards of interrogation. So if anything is happening at Guantanamo Bay that isn't legal, then there definitely should be a step where we can reform the prison because they should be following standards acknowledged by Congress.
Except even though they're no longer cruelly physically torturing them, they're still not meeting international standards. They are detaining them without trial in many cases for years. Even when they've been acquitted in many cases, they then don't have countries to return to repatriate, to return to. And so they remain at Guantanamo Bay. There are several that have stayed years after they've been acquitted, because they have nowhere to go back to.
That brings up my next kind of point here, and that shifts into the effectiveness. Some prisoners have been released, they've been sent back to other countries. What does the recidivism of these prisoners look like? Do they join back into the fight?
Yeah.
Do they become terrorists again? What's the effectiveness of our strategy?
Definitely, because 1/3 of prisoners that we've held there have returned to jihadist activity. And there was a previous comment by Obama that he said that out of like the 780 prisoners that we've held there, only a handful would return back to terrorism, but that is completely false because at least 196 have returned to terrorism and 79 others are suspected of it.
I have a few examples. The Long War Journal, which is an organization that does reporting of U.S. actions in the Middle East, reports that, and I'm sorry I'm going to mispronounce this person's name, but Ibrahim al-Quozi served, who was once held at Guantanamo Bay. He, in July 2010, he pled guilty on terrorist-related charges. 2012, he was released to Sudan, and he ended up working for Al-Qaeda in Yemen as a spokesperson, doing recruiting things and being a leader of a cell there. So there are people who do return, and it's unfortunate because they hadn't learned the lessons.
Well,
So what do you suggest? Do you suggest that we detain them indefinitely, that we execute them? What other solution do you propose?
Well, almost anything's better than being drowned in a cage like they're doing to our people or to other Christians or anyone who's an enemy of jihad, of their states. One of the practices is they round people up, put them in cages, and drown them in the ocean. So that's much more humane than that.
I would just like to bring up about how we're just like detaining prisoners when, I mean, Obama thinks it's morally right to drone people of ISIS. Like, why can't we detain people that are a part of the group? Like, how is that different than droning people?
Well, I think using the other flaws and shortcomings of the United States to argue against giving prisoners their basic human rights is sort of not the right direction to go in, because yes, I believe the U.S. is making mistakes using drones and violating rights in that way, but that doesn't necessarily justify other rights violations, even if you would say that they're less important. They're still very important. These are people's lives.
But
So
if
if
the rules are followed, like based on the Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, then their basic human rights won't be taken away. So in the past, their basic human rights have been taken away, but we want to reform it so that that doesn't happen anymore. And if we close it down, where do we put these highly dangerous people? And if we put them in America, won't that put Americans in much more danger than they are now to terrorist attacks?
That just brings up one more thing. I want to know what kind of people are there, what have these people been accused of, and more importantly, have these people actually been afforded a trial? You bring up habeas corpus, but it's somewhere out of the roughly 90 to 100 people, only around 15 to 20 of them have actually been set into the process of having a military tribunal, and the rest of them are actually being held indefinitely. So I want to know, what have these people actually done, and what kind of people have been approved for release or transferred through the Obama administration?
Well, we have to also remember that in eyes of a lot of people, like, these are war prisoners. A lot of them haven't even been classified, with some exceptions, as criminals. Like, they haven't been accused of a lot of things. There are so many people, especially from after 9/11, like, this is when Guantanamo Bay opened as what it is known now. There are the trials for 9/11 that are still going on and still in the early stages, where they haven't even classified what can be considered evidence for the cases or not.
And as Haley was saying, many of these prisoners are held from 9/11, which was 17 years ago? No, 15 years ago. And the information that these prisoners have that the United States is trying to get from them by these extremely terrible torture techniques is outdated, and it's not going to help the United States in any way.
The
But are
torture
you-
techniques aren't used anymore,
Well,
so
with-
that's
hold
what
on,
I'm
hold on,
saying.
hold
And
on,
with
hold on.
regard to that,
Are you arguing that we let these people go now? I mean,
No,
9/11
not
is
at
the
all.
worst attack in our country's
Yes,
history, and
not
it's
to
been
degrade
only
that.
15 years. We put people away for 25 to life for murdering one person in this country.
Yes, but to hold someone in a camp because of the terrible acts, the United States shouldn't be
Isn't that
dwelling
what
on
prison
the,
is, though?
Yes, the United States shouldn't be dwelling on the terror, but we should be trying to move towards healing.
right. And prisoners should be afforded rights is the
Yes.
basic thing that we're getting to. And also in terms of the cruel and unusual torture punishments that were inflicted and that Guantanamo Bay became notorious for, even though those are less of a problem now, much less of a problem, the international community is still crying out against rights violations. These people are being detained without trial in many cases, with unfair trials that do not meet United Nations and other rights groups, human rights groups standards. It's appalling, really, because really, imagine if your child was detained for 14 years without a trial, without charges, and couldn't leave. If they did get a trial, it wouldn't be a fair trial. They wouldn't have a lawyer. What would they do? What would that position be like?
Why would, I mean, if my child was trying to kill a bunch of people, so what? Then I did something wrong, then they get punished for it. I mean, I'd cry a little bit, it'd be awful, but in the end of the day, would it be such an awful thing that my psychopathic son would be locked up? If they have no remorse or empathy for what they've done, then I guess that's just the case it goes. That's just my stance on it, but I don't think it's fair to throw our children under the bus that haven't even been born yet.
Do you think in general it's okay to abuse and not give rights to prisoners, even murderers, people like that? Do you think they don't deserve rights? They're not human?
Do they?
Because of their status as enemy combatants, to some extent, they don't deserve as equal rights as people who are like innocent citizens.
But they deserve the
They-
rights
they aren't
afforded by the
guaran-
Geneva Convention.
They aren't guaranteed the rights of the United States Constitution. And I think that's like also what we kind of assume when we talk about rights also. And like that's a big concern for moving prisoners here, because if we were to put them in our prisons, then they would be entitled to a complete and fair trial when maybe they have committed an act against the United States.
But still, so
I
you're
just wanna
saying that
interrupt
they
just
shouldn't
for-
get a fair trial. You're saying they should get an unfair, unjust trial that will condemn them no
No,
matter
I'm
what.
I'm going to
saying
step in
that,
one
but-
second and just throw in another question having to do with this idea of trials and whether it should be military or civil. First, I just want to bring a quick update to the viewers. You're watching We the Students, a public affairs political discussion of AP government students at Nauset Regional High School. At the bottom of your screen is a special email address for our panel. Please feel free to email us your thoughts and suggestions about today's topic so we can continue this discussion in our government classroom. You guys bring up the idea of trials and a military trial versus one guaranteeing the constitution of your peers of a civil trial. And this brings up an interesting discussion of what would be more effective in terms of these people being detained at Guantanamo Bay. I guarantee if you put one of the architects of 9/11 on a civil trial, 10 out of 10 times they're going to have not a fair jury. it's just not going to happen in the U.S. But is that going to be guaranteed with a military tribunal either? And which one do you guys think would be more effective in handling these people?
I mean, either way, I would think it could possibly go. If we do a civil trial, then it provides more light to what's going on in Guantanamo and may provide more urgency for more above board things to happen, you know, not underhand, keep the trial off forever and ever and ever. It put more urgency to it because the public knows that they might be involved. So as a part of reform, it may be a good idea to have civil trials.
If we move trials here, I feel like liberal justices would also maybe see the detainment that the prisoner is having. They would also maybe release the prisoner because they might think that they're being treated unfairly when they actually might have committed a crime against the United States.
I don't think that would be as much of a problem. I think the main issue here is that if we give them a civil trial, then they will actually be getting fair, equal rights, which is a good thing to work towards. One of the main criticisms of Guantanamo Bay is the military trials, how they deny judiciary rights that most people, or that supposedly all people are supposed to be assured under international law and treaties. I think a civil case, civil trials are a necessity here to sort of rectify a lot of Guantanamo Bay's past errors.
If we were to close Guantanamo Bay, what do you suggest we do with these highly dangerous people? Do you think we should just release them into the world to continue committing horrible acts of innocent people? Or like, what do you think we should do?
I don't think so. I mean, many of these people have done terrible things that should be, and they should be tried for that. And the jury and the judicial system should determine how they are punished for that. But Guantanamo Bay is the complete opposite of everything the Constitution in the United States was built on.
But they're not on American soil and they're
Yeah.
not American citizens, so they don't have the rights that the
But
Constitution
don't
grants
even
them.
consider the Constitution. Think of the Geneva Convention. Think of the United Nations. Think of human rights, not
Well,
American
I thought of it.
rights.
I thought of it.
They
I thought of
deserve
it.
those.
You bring up the Geneva
Well,
Convention a ton. I just want to clarify, Guantanamo Bay is not categorized as a camp for prisoners of war.
Yes. They're enemy.
So if you're going to make the argument for human rights, you have to follow that categorization. I'm just going to open it back up real quick, but it's not specified. They don't fall under the jurisdiction of the Constitution as you suggest, and it's not quite as clear-cut if they do under the Geneva Convention.
I think in terms of closing Guantanamo Bay, I know what I think. I think it should be closed in Cuba and at least brought to the U.S. so it is on U.S. soil, so we have more control over it and just more insight. Because a lot of what happens at Guantanamo Bay, it's still kept under radar and very secretive, and we don't know everything that happens there. So I think it should be moved to the U.S.
Yeah, we need to move the prisoners to United States prisons, give them trials in the U.S., not by the military, fair trials. That way we can move this along, stop them from being detained just forever, just unendingly.
What good does it do to bring them onto U.S. soil? Would it not inspire more people to, more terrorists or whoever, to come over here and try to do something more personal? Now that they're on our soil, we're making it more personal. It could at least appear, or if they happen to escape, they're on our soil and they can start doing damage instantly.
Well, don't you
I
think
would
the
also-
violations of their basic rights in the Guantanamo Bay, whether it is in the past of torture or the current state of denied trial, don't you think that inspires terrorists to come try to free them or attack the United States directly?
When you
Well-
say move terrorists to U.S. soil, I would just like to point out that Congress has passed a legislative act that bans terrorists coming from Guantanamo Bay to U.S. soil. And I feel like because Congress passed it, which is an equal representation, it's an elected body, we elect them every 2 or 6 years, the House is more representative. But because they have decided that they do not want terrorists on U.S. soil, I feel like it should be a fair and it should be respected as a decision that we should have to just face.
I think you also have to consider that just this February, President Barack Obama submitted legislation to do just what we're talking about, close Guantanamo Bay, give them trials in the U.S., not military trials, move them out of Guantanamo Bay. So that is currently
Yes.
happening.
And
So this whole
this-
argument is sort of a
but-
moot point,
and then
because it's happening right now.
But then our Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, he even, after Obama mentioned that, he said that Obama was practically going against law because we already have a bill in place saying that terrorists cannot come to U.S. soil.
Based on a recent Gallup poll, 66% of people oppose closing Guantanamo Bay, and because we are a country ruled by the people, shouldn't we respect what the people want, what makes them feel safe?
And plus, what benefits do we get as Americans for bringing them under our soil?
Well, what about the Colorado Supermax that was said, like, that has terrorists in it?
Yeah,
People
so
from 9/11.
for the viewer, what she's talking about is there's a Supermax prison in Colorado where Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and a few other known and convicted terrorists are currently residing. That was pre-legislation by Congress, but that's an interesting point. What would it look like if the Guantanamo prisoners were to be moved here? What are the implications? What kind of effects would it have on the U.S. in terms of international view and potential recruitment for terrorism and other things like that?
Well, Guantanamo Bay, because the prisoners there are treated so terribly, it's kind of like a recruitment area for the prisoners because they're unified in their defiance against the United States and the terrible things that they're doing to them. But if they were treated fairly and moved to the United States, maybe they wouldn't be filled with such hatred towards the United States.
There's a lack of evidence to support that, and any U.S. domestic prison facility would be far more vulnerable to attack, which would make American citizens more vulnerable, and then we could have another terrorist attack like 9/11, and the cost of rebuilding our nation and like the amount of lives that would be lost from that would be just really awful for
Well,
America.
similarly,
also
there's
doesn't
just
have
as much
any
a lack of evidence for
Yeah.
that. Neither of these points have evidence for them. We don't know. It hasn't happened. So you can't necessarily say that if we move terrorists to the U.S., they'll immediately attack us. We don't know.
You brought up the point about how if we have Guantanamo Bay, like it's more of like a recruitment tool for terrorism. But we have to remember that Islamist ideology will persist no matter what, even if Guantanamo Bay is present. It's just, I feel like it's something that helps the United States secure potential threats to the United States. If we close Guantanamo Bay, it's not going to stop people from practicing terrorism.
That's true, but why can't they be stopped from practicing terrorism and also be granted basic human rights?
Yeah,
Why didn't they think-
denying human
We're not-
rights?
We're not, what?
That's
We're not
Well,
denying
you're
human rights.
protecting.
It's not like people
this,
get more
right?
rights just because they're on U.S. ground. That means nothing. They can be in Guantanamo Bay and still get the same rights they would here.
But
So
they
if you
haven't.
want to talk about reform, okay, so what? That's the fault of administrations and the CIA and other things.
You
It's
can
not
give
my
people the
fault.
rights and still keep Guantanamo Bay
Yeah.
open.
Do you agree with that? Keeping Guantanamo Bay if they have like complete fair trials? Like if you're talking about human rights, would you agree with keeping Guantanamo Bay open if it was reformed?
I don't see how there would be fair trials at Guantanamo Bay because currently they have the military trials. So even if they give everyone trials in the first place, which they haven't for the vast majority of people there, they would need to not have the military, highly biased and different trials. They would need to have normal trials, fair trials, which couldn't happen at Guantanamo
That couldn't
Bay.
happen in America either. As he said, the jury would probably be very partial because these people have committed terrorist attacks and done terrible things. So obviously the jury would be very partial.
Well, not
and
all of them have committed terrible things.
And also you're
Less than 1% have.
also
Well, that's debatable.
A lot
Also,
of them
to
have
an
very
extent,
extensive
you're missing
thing.
the point, in
Well-
that it's not just that the jury is impartial, that they may be biased, it's also that the military is fundamentally using different procedures for their courts. They don't give them counsel necessarily. They use evidence that would otherwise be deemed illegal.
And that can change. We can have reform without closing it. Right? If you don't like the waffle your moms are making, you don't have to leave your house. You don't have to excommunicate your family to get better waffles, guy. Things can change.
Okay.
I'm just going to move it along to one more idea here. So Obama has set forth plans to start reducing the prison population at Guantanamo Bay, and an evaluation of prisoners that are okay for transfer. We've recently transferred 5 prisoners to Qatar in exchange for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. And there's other prisoners that we are considering transferring to countries for detention there. So who's left over? Are there any numbers on what kind of people are left over? And can we bring those people over? Are those the ones who are actually accused of a crime?
There
Obama wants to bring 47 detainees into America. I do know that. And 35 are in the final stages of agreements with other countries, while 10 are undergoing military tribunals. So that's like the present case for his so-called closing Guantanamo.
Yeah, a lot of those, like of the 35, they have been there for 14 years waiting to get out. And I know when they do get out, there are 26 countries that take the people, and they do have programs like rehabilitation centers and stuff. But that's once they're out of Guantanamo Bay.
But are those really helpful? Because if you see the numbers and you see that a third have returned to terrorism, I don't feel like some of the foreign countries are saying what they're doing. They're still returning to terrorism. And in fact, one was a part of the Benghazi attack of 2012. One of the culprits and was involved in planning the attack was a Gitmo detainee who had been released. So if we release them to foreign countries, I don't feel like we have to have more strict procedures of how they're released to other nations.
So why would we release them to foreign countries when we can just house them in the United States, give them a fair trial, represent the facts of the case, and determine if they are a true threat to American safety?
We can do all that, but at Guantanamo Bay, it is a territory.
But because it's not on U.S. soil, there's so much room for error in administration.
I think Brian has a good point here. It's technically U.S. soil.
Well,
We do
yeah,
have
It
a.
is.
Not what I mean.
It's not in the
Yeah.
continental U.S.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's not in the continental U.S.
It could be in
I think
Hawaii,
what's being
but
established
it's
here is
still-
that we have actually leased the land from Cuba. It is U.S. land. It's a military installation. We have precedent set and forth that on a military base or some kind of diplomatic area, that is the soil of the home country. For example, Senator John McCain during the presidential election was actually born in a different country, but he was born on a military installation, therefore being a naturalized citizen. So I think the argument that they're not on continental U.S. soil or in a state is a little bit different there.
Right. That's more what we mean in that they need to be. It's more that they need to be away from the military tribunal court system and into the more American on the continental U.S.
Okay, and that again, we keep on saying that can happen with or without the bay closing.
But also, I think something to consider is that some of these people have been there for 14 years, for as long as it's been there. So when we're talking about the past rights violations, I mean current rights violations, but the past torture, waterboarding, awful sexual offenses, that's not something that happened long ago. That's something that happened very, very recently, and to some of these people. So they lived through that.
2008.
Well, again, these are people who are suspected of trying to harm U.S., not even U.S., just anybody's lives. And so, I don't know, the sympathy game and the moral game and empathy game doesn't really work so well.
And if
Also,
there- if there
people who
has-
are suspected of a crime, say a murderer or even a terrorist, they should be sexually assaulted. They should be waterboarded.
No,
That's
if,
not-
if
that's
there
not
is,
happening
and if there is
anymore.
torture
That's
going on in
Right, but
Guantanamo
that
Bay,
happened
Congress has
recently.
Yes, but we've
Congress.
fixed that.
Okay.
Congress has
But this
passed.
still happened to some of these people.
There's
And there's
recent-
But it
potential-
And
shouldn't
we can't
be.
do anything about that. That shouldn't have happened,
So-
but we've stopped it from happening. We've brought light to the situation and ended it.
So I'm going to end the broadcast on that note. Thank you guys for the awesome discussion. Please email us with your suggestions, keeping this discussion going. Again, we want to thank Nauset High School's television production class and Lower Cape TV for making this valuable experience possible for all of us. And that concludes our last segment of We the Students, a political discussion sponsored by Nauset Regional High School's AP US Government and Politics program. I'm Tyler Cremens, and thank you for watching.